Hi, I'm Robert Fall, and together with my partner Linda Rosenberry, we're going to go over grief support as it pertains to pastoral care and counseling. But first, we need to define grief. And grief itself is a normal response to any significant loss in one's life. This includes, but is not limited to, the loss of a job, the loss of a home, the loss of an athletic game, the loss of one's health, any significant object, opportunity, divorce, limb, good neighbor, pet, or even the departure of one's child to college. Though grief can have many causes, the most significant is that of losing a loved one. Grief is the experienced deprivation and anxiety that manifests itself through a person's behaviors, emotions, thinking, physiology, and interpersonal relationships. It's a broad term that covers a lot of things. So we'll look at some of the dynamics of grief and what that means to the individual, and also eventually what that means to the counselor or the one providing pastoral care and counseling. The dynamics of grief. Grief is generally accompanied by anxiety and sorrow, but this anxiety is experienced is that of separation in nature. It's a separation type of anxiety. It is often the cause of an individual will have physiological responses to the loss of someone as well, and we'll get into some of those. It seems that our own lives seem to be threatened by the death of someone with whom we've had a deep and meaningful relationship with. Anxiety can seep in when we begin to question our own death, as well as how we're going to make it without the individual that we lost or the thing that we lost in our lives. But it's also important to note here that sorrow is not a form of anxiety, nor is it a kind of depression. Those are two different things. Rather, it's a deep sadness often associated with different levels of hurt that someone feels. Proverbs 15:13 tells us, "A glad heart makes a cheerful face, but sorrow of the heart, the spirit is crushed." This crushing of the spirit is often described as coming in waves that includes restlessness, apathy, memories of the past, loneliness, and also sleep disturbances. It is generally agreed that there is no set pattern that the grieving process follows. For effective grieving counseling, though, it's important to note and understand how grieving may present itself in the individual, and what are considerable normative stages or phases of grief that may be experienced in any given time with no set order, no prescribed pattern. And so notice how these stages have a physiological implications as well. When we talk about numbness, denial, and shock. In this stage, the grieving person may not even appear to be affected by the loss yet. Yearning. In this stage, people feel intense waves of pain that are consciously experienced. In addition, they have an intense longing for the person or the object that they lost. Disorganization and despair. The aforementioned feelings still exist, but some of their intensity has diminished, but the person still is in a cloud or a fog or disoriented. And then we get into reorganization of behavior. The person that has suffered the loss has made some kind of modification in their behavior or life that is helping them cope with the loss. Notice I didn't say that it was a positive change in one's life that they're taking to cope with the loss. It's important to realize that sometimes people make bad choices for coping mechanisms upon the grief or because of grieving somebody that they loved or experiencing a loss. Some of the theological reflection on grieving. We see that in both the Old Testaments and the New Testament that grieving was recognized as very important. Amos 15 or 5:16 refers to professional mourners who used to wail and profess anguish loudly. They were basically paid to be sad and mourn the loss of someone that was lost. This could go on for a week, could go on for 2 weeks, but they were basically paid by the family to invoke that type of grieving and that type of emotion by the remaining survivors or the ones that didn't have the loss. And Jesus himself demonstrates the importance of grieving well. In Matthew 5:5, he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And we know that Jesus also wept on hearing the news of Lazarus. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was crushed with anticipatory grief. And that's in Matthew 26:38. In the light of Jesus' substitutionary atonement, Christians find reason to hope in times of intense sorrow. And Paul states in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 that we do not grieve as others do who have no hope. So the rationale for grief and offering grief support we can find in Romans 12:15. That's a clear call to support those who suffer grief. He says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep," because grief can be debilitating in its initial stages. It's important for the pastoral counselor to be able to provide support and guidance to reassure those who are grieving that they are experiencing normal, that what they're experiencing is normal. In light of the experience of the loss, we need to know that they are still valued and that others care for them. Grief, particularly over the loss of a loved one, may last longer than a year. It's important that grief support also continue during that time frame so that the ones grieving can have the help they need to adjust to the new dynamics of their life after the loss is suffered. We'll get into some of the causes of grief now. Causes of the grief, as stated earlier, is caused by loss, significant loss, crisis, life transitions, and life changes in one's life. It is normal. It's a normal process. It's a normal feelings. All those feelings are normal. The amount of grief one feels is related to the following. Sudden loss versus anticipated loss. Grief may be magnified if the loss is sudden, such that of a child that is taken from the parents too early, or an accident, or even a job loss that comes out of nowhere. The type of loss then is important as well. It's still hard, but maybe not as hard to lose a parent, an aging parent as opposed to a young child. The type of loss we get into plays a huge impact on the impact that grief will have on the individual. For example, the loss of a job is much more impactful if that's the only source of income for the family, as opposed to a dual income family in the loss of one job. Beliefs. What one believes about death and the afterlife, or lack thereof, strongly impacts how one copes with loss. The Christian finds reason to hope through Jesus Christ. Sometimes hope is the only light that can be seen in the fog of grief. The background and personality of the individual will also play a large factor in how they deal with grief and how much it impacts them. Individuals who are dependent, insecure, unable to express feelings or other states that have a harder time, or other stress, may have a harder time grieving than those not under the same burdens who are more emotionally healthy. Still, those who have experienced many traumatic losses may be impacted more than those who have not. Grief is always difficult, but those who have had a normal experiences with loss tend to cope better than when those things happen. Social and cultural environments also play a huge impact on how heavy grief is on somebody. Almost every culture has some way to deal with grief. Now, this way could be, this way typically is what is normative or what is socially acceptable amounts of grief one can show. For example, in the West, it's much more people are much more of the mindset that let's grieve, get it over with, and move on. Where in the East, Eastern cultures, it seems that the grieving process takes a much longer time. It's more carried out and more corporately done than it is here in the West again. Other issues that contribute to the weight of grief include, but aren't limited to, the mode of death, the dependency of the person, the work environment, broken promises, survivor's guilt, callous friends, and jumping back to normality too quickly. All of these things can help lead to complicated grief. That covers this portion of it. My partner Linda will continue on with the effects of grief and then how that impacts a counselor or our pastoral care towards the individual that's grieving. Thank you.